Okay, but also, so thanks for coming, guys. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where QUT and where we are now, the land of the Turrbal and the Yugara people. Acknowledge that these have always been places of teaching and learning, and that these have been and always will be Aboriginal lands. And it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Pirjo Haikola today from RMIT, an underwater designer, researcher, diving instructor, sailor, and ocean advocate. She's a lecturer at RMIT University and a collaborator in the Reef Restoration and Adaptation program for the Great Barrier Reef. And in this talk, Pirjo discusses her more than human and regenerative design projects, spanning from exhibitions and events aiming to increase ocean literacy to collaborating in marine conservation projects through design and material innovation. Thank you so much, Pirjo. We look forward to it.
Thank you very much. We had a bit of a conversation before already about I can't expand on everything on the talk. There are a lot of dimensions to this project. So hopefully we can have a nice conversation afterwards and we can go into the topics that you're really interested in or the areas of your expertise. It's going to be kind of a quick run through of a few projects and kind of my journey of getting to this kind of design, which I'm sure we all have our origin stories of how we end up working in more than human area. So I will talk about more than human design, obviously, that's why I'm here with you, regenerative and conservation design, and especially design for the ocean and ocean literacy. That is where I've been focusing on for the past more or less 7 years now. And to kind of explain how I got to designing for the ocean, which is not a very common area, really, especially underwater, I'll tell you how I got there first. So quite a lot of years ago now, maybe about 10 years ago, I was really frustrated with industrial design. That's my background. And just making more stuff to this world that it doesn't actually need and not having a lot of positive impact. And it just felt kind of pointless to me. So I left design and I became a diving instructor. A bit of a leap. And I moved to Cairns to work at the Great Barrier Reef, and then to Mexico to the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, which is the world's second largest reef. So what you saw here is kind of what I expected and what we all kind of think about when we think of these coral reefs, these absolutely amazing and vibrant, beautiful environments. And you being here in Brisbane, you might know that there are really amazing bits to this reef here, but there are also things that are not doing very well. Let me see if I can get to the next slide. Here you go. So unfortunately, I happened to work in Cairns in 2016 during one of the many bleaching events. And as you can see, the red dots around Cairns and further north from there, there was a really severe bleaching happening that summer. And we were there, and BBC was saying, you know, the reef is dead and all this kind of stuff. And tourists were really wondering, like, is there anything to see? And we did see quite a lot of bleaching ourselves underwater. But of course, it's not that everything bleaches. It's not that everything died, but it was a pretty bad time to be at the reef. It was a very, very hot summer. And then, of course, it happened again the following year. And then it happened in 2020. And then it happened again last year, and we're probably going to have it this year because it's going to be El Niño year, and probably the year after because it's even worse, like 2016, 17. So now that I've worked at the reef as a diving instructor and now as a researcher, I've actually seen 3 of these bleaching events. And that has pretty much broken my heart. It is just awful to be there when that's happening.
Are they in a certain season? Or?
Summer.
All right.
Yeah, it happens in the summer usually, when the temperatures rise. You know, in the winter, it tends to be pretty good. If there's a cool winter and cool period afterwards, some of the corals can recover, but it doesn't necessarily lead to mortality every time. The bleaching can be temporary. It depends how prolonged it is and how much heat stress and other stress the coral has been under already before. So that kind of depends.
So the end of this season, that's the result.
Yeah, so this is kind of the measuring of like end of the summer period of where the bleaching was seen during that particular summer time over those months. And you can find the Gurumpa posts these reports every summer. So you can kind of see a monthly reporting because they monitor constantly. So this summer, we'll probably have a report every month that will show what's happening. So, but we are not expecting a great summer, basically.
Summer now.
Yeah, to me, it is coming from Melbourne. It feels very, very warm. And then from that, I moved to Mexico, to the Mayan coast, which should kind of look like this, similar to up in Cairns, where you have a rainforest meeting the coast, meeting the mangroves, meeting the seagrasses, and then the coral reef. But it doesn't actually look very much like that there anymore. It looks more like this. So I worked in one of these mega resorts, and a lot of the coast has been built up like this. So you can imagine that the coast is really cut off now by the really intense development. So that development cuts the rainforest connection from the reef. It also causes sedimentation because there's a lot of artificial beaches. A lot of these beaches are not this big. They pour a lot of sand on them. So that then flows onto the reef and suffocates the seagrasses on the reef. You have a lot of sewage runoff, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of excess nutrients getting into the water. When I was there were reports they found cocaine in the water because there's so much partying going on. Pretty nasty. And now they have approved a new railway that is going to cut right through the rainforest. The Mexican president has approved that, which is going to enhance this even more. And there's a lot of community resistance, but it's not being heard. So very tricky, really tricky place. One of the consequences of what's happening there is that you tend to have these sargassum issues in the past few years that you might have seen. So sargassum is part of the ecosystem naturally, but when there are so many nutrients in the water, it just blooms out of proportion. So you might have seen like some beaches have meters of pileup of sargassum, and then it starts rotting and it creates these gases that are actually toxic to people and for anything that lives there, and it tends to suffocate and cover everything. So that's one of the consequences of that amount of nutrients in the water there. And then both at the GBR and at the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, the consequences of bleaching and degradation and cyclones, et cetera, can kind of end up looking like this. Here, it's like completely collapsed ecosystem and the coral has just turned into rubble. Or it's just growing algae. And there's, as you can see, all of a sudden there's no fish. There's nobody around. It turns into an underwater desert, really. And there's just this really nasty cyanide algae that covers everything. And once that happens, you almost can't bring it back. It's gone too far into a phase shift that you can't really restore it anymore.
Solely from the temperature of the water?
A lot of things. So at the Great Barrier Reef, it's mostly temperature. And in Mexico, it's all this stuff that I was mentioning. Sewage, all these nutrients, sedimentation, all this kind of stuff. So that compounds the climate change effects. But mostly here at the Barrier Reef, it's temperature. And cyclone events. So some of these areas that you see like a lot of broken coral, you can have a cyclone event and then you get bleaching and then it's just depends on this. So seeing this and knowing that these areas are there is pretty gut-wrenching, really. So my going into becoming a diving instructor and just ignoring the world didn't really work out that well. So I decided that I needed to go back to design, but I wanted to figure out if there is a room for industrial design to contribute to some of these ocean-related topics and also regeneration, conservation, literacy, etc. And then I went back to Finland for a bit after 20 years of being away. And I started to collaborate with Julia Lohman, who you might know. She does a lot of seaweed work and seaweed sculptures. And we started to work together. And we decided to make a proposal for Helsinki Design Museum to curate an exhibition about specifically different kind of art and design practices for the ocean. And we got the commission and curated Critical Tide in 2019. And I'll share a couple of projects that were really kind of important for me to figuring out what I can do and what are the different kinds of approaches and really inspirational projects that we had there. So the first one, it's a really cool project. It's called Hair Mats. By Lisa Gautier and Phil McGorry, and Matters of Trust. during the oil spill that was 2 years before that BP oil spill, close to where they are, they discovered that human and animal hair absorbs oil really, really well. And Lisa is a hairdresser, and they started to collect human and pet hair from pet trimmers and hairdressers, and first created these hair booms, and then worked with the community. The community really wanted to do something. They were feeling pretty helpless at that time. So they made these big booms and brought them to the beaches to collect the oil. And then later they modified the design and they started to weave these mats. And this is now being used in storm sewers, and car mechanics, and during oil spills. So it can be in different places where hydrocarbon waste can end up in the sea eventually. And they've also devised a really cool system that they grow fungi on them afterwards that absorb the hydrocarbons, and then they compost the mats so they can get rid of all the animals. That's really amazing stuff. So they, for the exhibition, they wove these really long mats for us. And what was pretty funny is that room smelled like dogs. Because it was mostly dog hair. So it was really funny. You walk by and like, oh, that's pretty strong. So, but really, really interesting project. And the Matters of Justice, of course, is still doing this work. And this is an image of one of the early ones of the booms and kind of how they were connected. And then you can sort of circle the oil spill and let it absorb into the booms. Yeah.
There's a network of salons here in Australia that is called the Sustainable Salons.
Yeah.
And they collect the hair, and I think that I don't know if it's
collaborating with them.
Collaborate with them
Could
or
be.
with another organization that does the same. But they also collect all the packaging and all the chemicals as well, and they have collaboration with the people who recycle that or has the other kinds of processing after, so that it's not thrown in landfill or waste. So
it could be a collaboration, very potentially. I haven't really
I'm glad to see that because I knew about the story, but I never seen the mats.
Yeah, they are really cool. They're really quite beautiful as well. Like the ones that they've always, they made it into it, but normally they don't really care about the colors and stuff. But for us, they made these really beautiful gradients and stuff. So they look really, really nice as well. The other project that I wanted to share that you may have seen or may not have seen, I'm not sure, is the Marsh system by Alex Scott. He's a really good friend of mine and now a collaborator. We just started doing a project together as well. We've been dive buddies since I moved to Melbourne. And this is his reef module, which is basically intended for those kinds of reefs that we saw earlier, these high-value reef areas, small areas where the reef has completely lost its structure due to dynamite fishing or a cyclone and other pressures. So there's no structure left, which means that the coral recruits don't really have anywhere to establish. It's too loose. They don't really grow there. So creating a system where you can position something there when there's no structure can help the natural corals recruit onto it, but also gives you something that you can transplant corals on top of. So that's why it has these indentations and features in the surface there. Alex also works a lot on other kinds of biodiversity related things, so that's what we are going to be collaborating in the next couple of years now as well. But this is the project that we took to Helsinki. You can replicate into as big as you like. And this is one image of very recent photo in the Maldives, where part of these are natural recruits, like some of the smaller ones. I was just spending a task. Some of the smaller bits there are natural recruits, so they've actually gone there naturally. It took a while because they didn't do any conditioning for them first. It's just pure ceramic, so for a while it didn't look like it was going to do anything. But then some of the natural recruits appeared, and then some of these bigger ones are transplants.
Is it like 5?
About, yeah.
Wow.
So I think 3-4 years it's been, yeah.
And the ceramic, you said?
Yeah, that's
The
right.
clay.
Yeah. Now he works a lot more with concretes and stuff. But this was a ceramic module. And also the idea of it is that the modules are fairly small, so you don't need very heavy infrastructure. You can take like smaller dive boats and stuff and just a few divers to put them down. You don't need these massive barges and things like that. So that also makes it a little bit more practical. But it's a small scale, so small areas where you really need to restore a limited spot for diving or high value reasons. Sorry?
And they're dropped in place.
You position them in place with divers. They're not fixed onto the bottom. They have enough weight to kind of hold their own. And if you kind of extend them more on the sea floor, then they will kind of sink a bit into the sand or into the features there, so they stay in place. So they are really quite.
Place them onto the rubble, or
Yeah.
do you place it close to
You
the
could,
rubble?
you could place them onto the rubble as well. Yeah. Rubble is actually, as soon as you put some weight on it, especially something so big, it will hold it.
Yeah.
If you put something smaller in it, it'll just kind of go through. Yeah. It's like,
That's why I was asking you how much it.
yeah, they are quite heavy, but they are not so heavy that you need like multiple divers to maneuver them and stuff like that. And a third project, the final one that I will say, we had I think 8 or 9 projects in there, is Radical Ocean Futures, that I thought was also an amazing project by Andrew Merrick, a scientist from New Zealand, and Simon Stolenhag, a Swedish artist. So this was Andrew's PhD project. He worked with the Stockholm Resilience Institute, if I'm not mistaken in saying it wrong now. And being an environmental scientist, he was looking at different kind of ocean modeling of what we are expecting to happen in the oceans, and then extrapolated them to 4 different scenarios. So there were 2 scenarios of collapse and 2 scenarios of kind of sustainment and recovery, where we managed to turn things around. And then he wrote this narrative from the future, kind of in a science fiction style, like if that was real. And together with Simon Stolenhag, then they made visualizations of what those futures would look like. And for the exhibition, we commissioned him to make audio pieces as well. So we had a voice artist speak out loud all the scenarios, so you could sit there and listen to the story in its entirety. They are about 10 minutes long each, kind of first-person narratives of what is happening in those places in the future. So I said we had 2 stories of collapse. We have Fish Inc. and the Rime of the Last Fisherman, probably pretty self-explanatory in a way. The Fish Inc. is spoken by a Norwegian daughter of fishing company that are now farming jellyfish, and there's like super engineered, crazy, genetically modified tuna in the water, and almost everything else is gone. And basically talks about this industrialized fishing, and if that goes unchecked, what that will lead to. The Rime of the Last Fisherman is kind of a similar, but it's a story of one of the last fishermen roaming the empty cities, which is really a terrible story. And then with 2 scenarios of like happy regeneration in a way, but interesting in both the scenarios, based on all the modeling and research he did, both of them include really radical innovation and radical conservation efforts for us to turn things around. And that kind of tells everyone like it's not enough that we do little interventions and little corrections. They need to pretty radical things for the oceans to make it, biodiversity to make it. So they were quite interesting. And then for audio pieces to go with those. So with those in mind, I think my projects will kind of have a bit of context. So after that, I moved to Melbourne and started to work at RMIT University, and had already recently been working at the Great Barrier Reef, but then I was really interested in what's going on in Melbourne and in Port Phillip Bay. And of course, you find problems everywhere you go. There's a similar thing happening there. I started diving in the bay, and due to climate change and warming water, excess nutrients, and lack of predators, also a very big effect is these little spiky guys have really exploded in numbers. Even if I talk to people in Melbourne, most people don't know this is happening.
Is that just like whereabouts are you here?
This is Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary of all.
It's big.
Yeah, it's Big Bay. Yeah.
Yeah, where? I used
Yeah,
to
so
know.
this is in Ricketts Point in Mulmars.
Yeah. Yep.
So this is a marine sanctuary, but this is happening there, which is a little bit sad. And then we dived, I'll show you a diagram next. So there are parts of the bay where they are really exploding in numbers. They are native purple sea urchin, but due to all these issues, they've now been able to grow in numbers a lot. And why this is kind of important is that the seaweeds are the keystone species of the temperate water. They basically play the same role as corals do in tropical water. They provide food and habitat for all the other creatures there. And when they're gone, the very same thing happens, like you can see here. All of a sudden, there's no fish. There's no anything else left. So the consequence is quite similar. To your location question, I have an answer straight away on the next slide. So there are quite a few scientists, especially from Melbourne Uni, who've been looking at this quite a few years now. And just a few spots here, not extensive survey of everything, but you can see there the green line is where the border between the seaweed beds and the barren areas is. So, for instance, if you look at Point Cook on the left there, in the 80s, the green line is where the seaweed beds would extend to. And then on the right, you see how much it has retreated since then. Williamstown, some of the footage there, the worst footage was from Williamstown. I got coordinates from Melbourne Uni, so we dived the worst places. We went all around the bay diving every single spot. And 1970s, the seaweed beds were massive, like really, really big and really quite healthy. And there's almost nothing left in 2014, and it hasn't recovered, it's gone worse. Umaris and Regiswan Marine Sanctuary also used to have really extensive seaweed beds. Part of it still looks okay, but it has retreated to just a very, very little sliver of the coast. So it's quite a dramatic change, and in some areas, 95% of the seaweeds are gone. And there is quite a big biodiversity of seaweeds in Port Phillip Bay. Actually, there's over 900 species of them there. And there are a couple of these very big macroalgae that are really important habitat building species. And if you talk to anyone in Melbourne and you say this is happening, most people are not heard about it. We look at the ocean as a horizon. We don't look at the ocean as something that there is something underneath. And this is really why I try to do underwater films, and I try to take people there and try to show them what's happening under there that they don't see.
Some of my friends would say diving in Melbourne.
It's pretty cold, I tell you that. It is cold, and it was very cold to do all those types of films. Of course, so what can we do about it? Most people know sea urchin like this as uni in Japanese cuisine, a beautiful orange roe. The problem that when they are in these barrens is that scientists call them zombie urchins, because they're kind of surviving, but they're barely alive. They eat the environment empty, and then they wait for better times. But they can survive for a very long time without food. So they can destroy their environment, but they won't die. So if any seaweed start to grow back, they will just eat away again. Quite a scary thing that way. It's a very resilient creature. So what can we do? We could look at aquaculture responses. So I work a bit with Fletcher from Melbourne Uni. They are developing a system where they take those urchins from the bay, they give them extra food and nutrients in aquaculture, and then they develop beautiful roe that can be sold to restaurants and markets and stuff. That way you create an extra incentive to start removing them from the bay, and you give a chance for the environment to recover. So they are working on this approach, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how they go with it in the coming years, and to start to actually remove the quantity we need to remove. What I was then interested in was the other side. This is maybe my own social side of things that I want to talk about. Because I realized nobody knows anything about this problem, and nobody knows how to cook anything with them, I did a couple of things where we experimented. So we did an event on the Yarra River boats, which is people floating around there, so they can't escape with the smelly urchins. And I collaborate with Longbroad and Fermion, who are they do a lot of cooking events and things. So I gave a bit of a talk about what's going on in the bay while we were floating on it. And then we made, for instance, fish shows from sea urchins, so fish. We made sea urchin butter and all kinds of other things, and interesting stuff for us as well. And everybody would take home a little jar of sauce they made to make ferments and all the shows. So basically the idea was that you can use sea urchins in a lot of ways, it's just that we don't know how, and because we don't know how, we don't buy them from the market, even if they were available. So that was kind of the intervention that we wanted to work on. The industrial designer in me was then really interested in what to do with all the shells, because then we will have tons and tons and tons of shells. They are 97 and something % calcium carbonate, a little bit of proteins, and then some pigments. And the pigments were absolutely fascinating. So I got an honor student from chemistry to work with me, and she did a bit of pigment separation analysis of what's going on there. And they are kind of the best thing, really. Like, the sea urchins are really, really simple creatures in a way. They don't have a central nervous system or anything, but they have these very fancy pigments. They are like the immune system. They are anti-algal, antifungal, antiviral, antibacterial, etc. So that's what keeps them healthy. And they've been used and studied for medicine. So they're used in Russia as a heart medicine. They were studied for COVID. There's a lot of studies now going into what can do with these fancy pigments. And one important thing that the urchins use them for is that algae would grow on their shells, but they're anti-algal. And I was kind of interested in that one, if we could retain some of those properties. So I made some crazy experiments. I realized that calcium carbonate is used as a filler for polymers. So I used sea urchin cell instead of pure calcium carbonate, and we wanted to try, well, maybe some of those properties would remain. Let's give it a try. And we made some sea urchin biopolymer composites, then control PVC and stuck them into the bay just to see what happens. This was a very random offshoot of work. And you can see in the middle, after 4 weeks, there's a little bit of difference. You can see a lot of barnacles on the PVC. They are a pain in my boat. Worst thing ever to scrape off.
Yes.
And then you see 8 weeks, and you can see quite a huge difference actually in terms of what's growing on it. So that was a very interesting thing. So you could potentially transfer some of these properties to materials. However, they are very fragile. They need to regenerate all the time. They degrade very quickly in UV light. So tricky. But this was an experiment that then led me to get a commission to an installation for the NGV 2020 Triennial, and later went to something in the future in Australia. At that time, I was really interested in seeing whether this material could translate to coral restoration, because it was suppressing the algal growth. That's the enemy of corals. And for this exhibition, I wanted to use the opportunity to show what's going on. So that's why we made 2 films, 2 underwater films, and I made an installation using my weird materials and 3D printed with my urchin biopolymer stuff, make them into coral prints. You can imagine how happy our technicians were with my smelly sea urchin smelling materials in the 3D printers and stuff. And I made also underwater photogrammetry to create these like hyper-realistic coral models, and then 3D printed them with this different versions of biopolymer sea urchin pigment and stuff. And then a couple of these films I can show really briefly. What is happening with time? It's pretty good. So I'll show you, this is, I think, the Port Phillip Bay film. So basically we wanted to do these 2 films, almost like 2 windows to 2 different places. So we shot them with exactly the same timing and same kind of sequence of going from really healthy environments, slowly transitioning to the collapse. And so they can show this on side by side. The Great Barrier Reef story that everyone knows, and then the Port Phillip Bay story that is not so very known. That's me jumping into the water. NGV really wanted, I didn't want myself in that. They really wanted the face, so I had to give them the face. But I always jump over that one at once. So I mean, this is, for instance, this is one of the emblem animals of Victoria. The weedy sea dragon. This is the southern smooth ray that can weigh 350 kilos. There's just absolutely amazing biodiversity in there that most people are really not aware that is actually there. These guys are really rare. So these are the weedy and leafy sea dragons are only in Australia. They don't live anywhere else. We have the weedies in Victoria, and then in South Australia we have the leafies. They're like a big seahorse. They are just absolutely beautiful, and the colors and everything are just spectacular. And the male carries the eggs. So yeah, so these two films that kind of follow the same sequence, and then you've seen a bit of this part. I'm going to jump over the Great Barrier Reef one. I think you get the gist of it. I think we're going to run out of time otherwise. And then I created this kind of abstracted landscape of corals with the two films, the backdrop. And I created this whole thing during COVID in my living room. So I had to bring all the printers eventually into my house. Not the big one, that was the only one that I could use, but then I brought other 2 3D printers into my living room and had to do all the printing there because we were in pretty serious lockdown. So that was an interesting exercise on its own. Okay, well then the material stuff led me to talk to Reef Restoration Adaptation program for the Great Barrier Reef. They were at the time really in the starting program and they were interested in design things, but also materials that could be used for coral restoration. And they were intrigued by my material experiments. So we started to work together. You may or may not know the program. It's the world's largest ever attempted effort to create resilience for an ecosystem. So there's now about 360 researchers in the program across different universities. QUT is part of it. There's quite a few people from QUT. That's why I'm also here because I have meetings yesterday. And UQ, JCU, also in New Zealand Marine Science coordinates efforts. And we have several sub-programs looking at all kinds of pretty radical innovations of how could we give the extra time. We experimented with my materials in the tropical water with corals, the effect in the repeat itself, very specific pigments that work just in the temperate water, didn't work there. But then I had also made more, because I had already gained quite a bit of knowledge on different biopolymers. I made a lot of different biopolymer composites with calcium carbonate, because I thought that it would probably create good skeletons since corals are calcium carbonate. So just using the biopolymers as a binder and then calcium carbonate as something the corals would recognize and would grow on, we made a lot of experiments. And one of them, one very specific blend, the corals liked a lot. So that's the one there on the right, where you don't have a lot of competing algae growing, but the coral is spreading quite a lot. So that's the one that we are kind of working on now and using it as one option for a few different things. But my sub-program is really looking at creating in-house corals in aquaculture, more heat tolerant, and then taking them to the reef in mass with minimal human intervention, with small devices that we can automatically basically chuck into the sea and then engage with the reef and allow the corals to recover. And using them in these very specific areas of the reef that the modeling indicates will seed the reef, that also need help but haven't gone too far in degradation either. So that is our sub-program, and that's a big group of people already. A teeny industrial design effort in developing a few things. A lot of the things that I've been doing is related to seeding devices. So we are looking at having the corals settle on these little settlement tiles in 3 different ways. Having them in aquaculture so that the spawn can naturally settle on them, and putting small fragments on them. And then the third one is very new, using live larvae to put into small pots that I've been working on. Just a few individual larvae in a very small amount of water, seeding in with a biodegradable film, and then you can take them straight to the reef without any aquaculture phase because they're kind of contained. Then the tiles will go onto the devices, and those devices will get chucked automatically into the sea. And the devices are fairly simple. This is one iteration. We don't know if this is going to be at all the final, but this is kind of where we're at now. It's made of very heavy aluminum ceramic, so the weight will keep it kind of on the bottom. And then those kind of arms will also engage with different kinds of features of the reef. And then this feature here is really crucial, and it has to be exactly that size so that the coral baby that's growing in there is protected from grazing fish when it's really small. And once it's big enough, it'll kind of grow out on the device. And because the reef is not a very homogeneous place, there can be flat reef tops, there can be really, really complex rugosity big features. We've gone for a modular design so we can have either individual bits or we can create more like a network so they don't fall in between crevices and features and stuff like that. So that's what we kind of current version of what we're looking at. And I'll just show you a really cute video of our first pods from last spawning. You can see those are coral larvae. So coral is free swimming larvae in its very early stages of life. They are like teeny 1 millimeter long worms that swim around in the water, and they will choose where they want to sit. And they're very picky. They are very, very picky of where they want to land. So that's a big effort of figuring out what do they want. And that is like the slightly speeded up. They're a little bit slower. Yeah. So it's a very bizarre client, but it's absolutely amazing to work with. And this is one of the prototype pods from last spawning that I made from the biodiverse carbonate stuff. And that is a settled coral. So that feature is what I designed for their house, and some of them went there. And it's like, so when the free swimming larvae eventually decide I'm going to sit there, they will transform. They will shift into a different form and start to become a coral, no longer a little worm. So that's how they look like when they're really, really small. And then we place all these things in the devices and we go into the field. We have now deployed about 6,000 devices to the reef. And we swim around in our plots and we simulate a free drop. We can't drop from the surface yet because we don't want to drop them on living coral, etc. So we are still very restricted, but we carefully drop them in a configuration on each plot. Drop them there. Then we do a photogrammetry of the whole site and replicate many, many times over. And that's me just dropping one of the chains. And then we have to go back and find them a few months later. So every 3 months or so, we have to go back and find them all, which is really hard. They're really small and the reef is very big. And each site is about the size of this worm, adding the three-dimensional complexity and colors and everything. And that's what they start to look like after a few months. So very, very tricky to find. So we have to find them all.
Like a tag or anything.
No, it doesn't really work very well in the water. Some of them have little tags, but you have to be this close, so you already found it by that time. So we have to go and find them all and register what the corals are doing, are they moving around, so we can improve the designs. And then maybe one of the most satisfying images of ever. This is a 1 year of coral being there. So after deploying all these 6,000 devices now, we had our first survivorship numbers from the team that is working on that. And after 4 months, we had about, I think it was 86% or 87% had surviving coral on the device. And after 1 year, still 67% had a surviving coral on the device, which is really high. And they are wild corals, they're not yet the enhanced ones that are being developed. So it's looking quite promising. We're quite happy that there's some promising results in our efforts. But now what happens is now we have to scale up and we have to improve and we have to make it conservation in an industrial scale, basically, which is going to be a very interesting effort. I think I'm in a pretty good time. I think I've been talking about 40 minutes. So how to conclude was my question yesterday. How do I conclude this? Where am I at now? Just starting a new project with Alex Gold and civil engineering to do 3D printed coastal protection from concrete, probably the Solomon Islands. I'm looking at combining some of these efforts of making structures that both biodiversity, but also protect humans on the coast and adaptation. And this project of RRAP is continuing. We're moving on to year 4 and I'm scaling and I'm starting to really look at the industrial scale of things. And at this moment, it kind of feels like to me that mostly in my projects, the non-human is the main beneficiary, the main client. And the human is often the secondary one, or potentially now in the new project more on a similar level of importance in a way. If you're looking at coastal protection, it kind of has to be almost equal, in my opinion. And really kind of realizing how the combination of industrial design and learning more about marine ecosystems and collaborating with scientists, and then combining that with material innovation, either working with chemists and then or chemical engineers. Those kind of become really important disciplines and ways of working to address some of these biodiversity issues in the kind of scale that we need to. Basically. That's how I currently feel where my practice is sitting at. We'll see in 2 years, and we'll see where it goes from here. That's kind of where it sits now. So I'm super happy to expand on any of these items there. There are a lot of details in a lot of aspects, and happy to talk about any other areas that you are interested in. Excellent. Thank you.